and welcome back to Talking Europe. French President François Hollande has made his position clear. He wants the UK to remain part of the EU. However, he says there will be consequences if the UK decides to opt out. What exactly those consequences might be remains unclear. Could bilateral agreements that see France and the UK working closely on both business and security issues be scuppered, or are such deals independent of the EU anyway? Well, to give us his view on that and the UK's general relationship with the European countries, we are joined by Britain's ambassador to France, Mr. Julian King. Mr. King, thanks so much for your time. Can I start with, firstly, give us an idea, why is the UK questioning its membership of Europe? It's been a member since 1973. It was around when the Lisbon Treaty was put together. It got opt-outs of parts it didn't like, but now it seems to be throwing the whole membership into question.
Well, as you know very well, this isn't an entirely new subject. There's been a lot of debate in the UK about our links with Europe, with the rest of Europe, continental Europe, for as long as I can remember. I've frankly grown up with it. But it had reached a point in advance of the last election where it was pressing. Some people have asked me, was it necessary to promise and organise a referendum? I don't know. I mean, it's a long time since I've done logic. I don't know whether it was sort of strictly logically necessary, but it become, I think, kind of unavoidable. In the past, people had suggested there was going to be a referendum and it hadn't happened. In order to really deal with this question, Prime Minister Cameron promised that if he was re-elected, he would organise a referendum. And having undertaken that commitment, he was determined, when he was re-elected, to follow through.
And I guess in some ways it's healthy to reinforce or relook at what that membership means. As you say, it seems to be a debate with the UK that's gone on since even before the European Union existed. Winston Churchill, one of his famous sayings, he was the idea behind a United States of Europe, but he seemed to want to be with Europe, but not of it. Kind of this distance. Is that still present, do you think, in the mentality in the UK?
Well, I think the debate that we're going to have, which is going to be a very lively debate over the next few months on the run-up to the 23rd of June vote, is going to play out around a choice between what we have, what we know of our relationship with the rest of the European Union, with the government believes many advantages, maybe some bits that you want to debate, but many overwhelming advantages on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you want to vote for leave, then a lot of unknowns. Some risk, but a lot of unknowns. Questions that aren't yet answered and which in some cases are going to be difficult, I think, for the people who are proposing the leave vote to answer.
OK, well, before we look at those parts up for debate and all those possible scenarios, let's take a look back at history for a moment. Today, France hopes the British public will choose to stay in, but in the past, France rejected UK membership to the European bloc twice. Before we go any further, let's take a quick look back at the UK's ties with the EU.
After just 6 years of UK-EU membership, former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was the first to rock the boat. In November 1979, she attended her first European Council meeting, where she's famously quoted as saying, "I want my money back." She was in fact asking for a rebate for Britain on its European Commission contributions. Her reasoning was the UK was getting much less in agricultural subsidies than other countries like France. Finally, after a 4-year battle, former French President François Mitterrand convinced then German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to give in to Thatcher's demands. She got her rebate, but the spat left its mark in Brussels. During the 1980s, the divide between Britain and the EU grew wider. In 1989, former Conservative MP Leon Britton was appointed European Commissioner, bringing with him a large injection of liberalism. He stuck up for European views despite pressure from his party, but often clashed with Jacques Delors, then President of the European Commission. He was steering Europe towards yet closer ties and a single currency. 1990 saw the arrival of John Major at Downing Street. He's remembered in Brussels for opting out of the single currency and the social chapter of the Maastricht Treaty and of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, refusing to accept a European proposal giving employees 3 weeks paid leave and a maximum 48-hour working week. As soon as elected in 1997, Tony Blair quickly set about smoothing things over with Brussels, signing up to the social chapter his predecessor opted out of. However, he sparked a rift in the Union when he rallied for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And in 2007, he would demand exemptions to key areas of the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights. For some of his critics, he gave too much power to the EU. For others, not enough.
So, Mr. King, correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, was the Conservative Party in the UK more or less pro-EU and it was the Labour that was Eurosceptic? But what we're seeing today is a split on all levels, notably inside that Conservative Party. You know, ministers already calling for an out. Is that going to have a long-term impact on British politics?
Well, I think that if you look at the details of this debate, you'll find that both of the main parties have had divisions within them to a greater or lesser extent over the years. And that reflects the fact that this is it's a big question, it's a big issue, and many people take it very personally and think about it from their personal point of view. It has long transcended party boundaries, and I think we're going to see it transcend party boundaries again during this debate.
Party boundaries and other kinds of boundaries, as well as infighting or a possible split within parties. There could be a split, some are saying, within the United Kingdom. Scotland seems very pro-EU and very definite about its position on that.
Well, as you know, the government in Scotland have declared very clearly that they think that the UK as a whole should vote to remain in the European Union, and that's the position that they're going to be campaigning on.
Even the people seem quite resolved there. Any idea why the Scots are so definite as opposed to the rest?
Well, there are different opinion polls, you're right, and some of those opinion polls suggested that there's a pretty clear majority in Scotland for staying in. But honestly, I think the opinion polls are going to move around quite a lot between now and the 23rd of June.
In the past.
Obviously, in the end, I hope that the government's position prevails and that we get a positive vote for Remain.
And on the off chance that didn't happen, do you think Scotland could go and have another referendum about their independence?
We're not there. Let's get to the 23rd of June and get the vote.
Okay. Now, one thing, the leader, if you like, almost of that Leave campaign, the leader of the UKIP party, Nigel Farage, he fears that the UK government could ignore a vote to leave the UK. It does have to be ratified by the Parliament. Do you think?
I think that that's unlikely because the Prime Minister has made very clear on a number of occasions, publicly and in Parliament, that the vote needs to be respected.
For you, is membership of the European Union a political thing or an economic one?
The arguments that we're going to see play out over the next few months, the case for remaining in, are both economic and political, if you like, security-related arguments. There are some very strong economic arguments. I won't rehearse them all. You probably will hear them many, many times over the coming weeks and months. But essentially, half of our business is with our continental European neighbours. And there are some very strong security or political, if you prefer, arguments, which basically revolve around the fact that in most political and certainly in most security action, you're better off doing it with partners and allies. So given, unfortunately, we face some terrible terrorist challenges at the moment, and we're sitting in Paris, so no one can deny that, given the sad history here. And the terrorists don't distinguish between countries or cities. They're after frustrating our way of life. We are better off dealing with that kind of threat by working together.
What would you say then to those who say that, because they do argue that the UK has better control, even though you're not in Schengen, but the UK would have better control of its borders if it withdrew from the EU?
What we're seeing in the challenge that Europe as a whole faces on migration at the moment is that when you have something on that scale and of that complexity, again, you are better working with your partners. We've actually devoted over £2 billion to helping the refugees in those countries. That's more than any other European country. But we're doing it with our European partners. We're then going to work with our European partners to try and control some of the routes to try and dissuade the traffickers who are the bad guys in all of this. It's not necessarily the refugees, it's the traffickers who are driving them to this.
Now, we did see one concrete example, if you like, of that cooperation between France and the UK at a recent, the annual UK-France summit. That announcement that it's again, I think, $2 billion going to be spent to make a prototype drone for security. How is that going to be deployed, used? What's it all about?
Well, it's the continuation. It's the next stage of a project that's been underway for a few years. And you're right. The two sides committed to spend €2 billion, £1.5 billion, on over a number of years on the next stage of development of something that is sometimes called a drone and it's sometimes called an unmanned fighter plane. But anyway, it's an attempt to work together to get the benefits of our shared technology and our shared industrial base to produce something that's going to be at the cutting edge of technology.
Now, one thing also that came out of that annual summit was the issue of bilateral ties. France and the UK have a lot of them. The one that cropped up in recent weeks is this 2K agreement. It's where you can have British police here in France to control the border around Calais, where you have thousands of migrants hoping to make it across. Some are saying that that agreement could be in danger if the UK leaves. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, you're right. There is an agreement that's a bilateral agreement for something called juxtaposed controls, which means that the French have controls in London, in St Pancras, in the Eurostar, and elsewhere in the UK, and we have controls in France, including at the port in Calais. And that actually has worked well because it's done a lot of good to facilitate trade and legitimate passage both ways. We have something like 20 million visits from Britain into France each year, and through the port of Calais, we import about 25% of the food that you find in British supermarkets. So there's lots of advantages to this system that's been set up because it works. It works. And that is one concrete example of the intertwined economic, social, civil society relationships that we have across the European Union.
Yeah. But you think that could be in jeopardy? Do you think, like we heard the French economics minister saying, well, hang on a minute, if you opt out of the EU, we're going to throw that out the window. Is that possible? Because it's a bilateral agreement.
Well, I mean, a number of people in France, including active in politics, have commented that if there was a vote to leave, then, you'd have to look at the aspects of the relationship. We are campaigning to get a positive vote to remain in the European Union.
What about the Brits abroad? There's over 2 million UK citizens living in other EU countries. I know that a lot of my colleagues are already applying for French nationality just in case. The Leave campaign would say, however, that that's absolute nonsense, that there is a Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, that if you have acquired rights and all in a certain country, it can't just be taken away. So whether or not the UK votes to stay or leave, UK citizens living in other EU countries, EU citizens living in the UK, they're all fine.
Well, again, you're asking me to sort of comment on
no, but this is in or out. It's the same.
Some of the arguments that are being advanced by people who support a Leave vote. The government position is very clear, is to support the Remain vote. And if you vote to Remain, then these questions aren't going to be posed.
But technically, do you think it could change? I mean, if the UK voted out, could things change on that level? People already settled?
I'm not going to speculate on that.
Okay.
If in some arrangement the rights of EU citizens from other EU countries in Britain were put into question, I don't know. Then in those circumstances, there will be questions asked, I guess, about Brits who are living elsewhere in the EU.
One country very concerned about the even idea of anything changing with the UK's relationship to the EU is Ireland. And you were ambassador in Dublin for many years, and you went on to work as the Director General of the Northern Ireland office. Looking at the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, do you think that could be affected by any possible changes with the UK relationship to the EU?
Well, if you support the Remain position, then some of these issues aren't going to arise.
That's true, but
I think the situation in Northern Ireland is, as you know very well, is a complicated, complex historical situation that people have spent decades working to get to the excellent position we have now reached. It is deeply rooted in the people and the society of Northern Ireland. I hope those roots are deep enough to survive whatever circumstances might befall them.
We touched on it briefly, but just going back to it, France and the UK, in terms of defence, they are the two major defence countries in Europe, in the European Union, really, aren't they? They spend the most on it. They're both nuclear powers. They're both part of the UN Security Council. France needs the UK to stay in the EU in terms of that, does it not?
They have that culture in common, who actually have a military that it can be and is, certainly in the case of France at the moment, extensively deployed overseas. They have all of that in common. And I think that is important. It's an important part of the relationship. And I think it's important for Europe to have that partnership at the heart of our common security and defence work.
Finally, the other big topic that comes up is the economy. Just looking at the IMF a year or two ago, they said that the UK was the fastest growing economy in the G7. You do have you're not part of the single currency. Is the proof of the booming British economy somewhat proof that going it alone is stronger?
I think that that's a short question that touches on a big subject. And we are very proud of the success that we've had in the British economy over recent years, and long may it continue.
And of course, there's that whole question about the city and people saying that it could move from London to Paris if things could change. Mr. Julian King, we are out of time, but thank you so much for being with us here on France 24. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.